I got the warning, so we're recording. Okay. Do you just want us to go, or do you want, is there any other? Okay, cool. We can do that. I will reshare my screen. Um, Share. All right. And I am, yeah, okay. Are you seeing the screen now? Everything look okay? Okay, cool. I did not get the green bar around it this time. Um, so yeah, we are here to talk about taxonomies in Islandora. We're going to talk a little bit about how they work at a pretty high level. Um, we're going to look at some potential challenges and some opportunities. The Basically, this is the roadmap we're looking at. We're going to talk a little bit about where we work and who we are that was talking today, give some more information about just like how the taxonomies function in Islandora too, in case you're not familiar with that, and then look at some ways that we kind of built foundations at Pitt to be able to use taxonomies. And then we'll go into kind of a in-depth some in-depth examples of how we prepared content to work with the taxonomies. We're going to wrap it up with some future projects and things that we're considering kind of as next steps. And we hope to have plenty of time if people have questions or want to have a discussion about anything. Um, so Speaking today will be myself, Mike, Tyrika, and Megan. And we're all at the University of Pittsburgh and we work with our digital collection. So our digital collection team is cross-departmental. We have people in our systems development area. We have people in archives and special collections, and we have people in our communications and web services that all kind of come together to select materials, make them available, get them described, make sure the systems continue to run. I'll also mention now that we're working with Born Digital. They're hosting our content, and we're collaborating with them to make sure the migration finishes, and we'll be continuing to collaborate with them throughout our work. Um, the team that I just mentioned specifically is the metadata discovery unit. We're part of our resource acquisitions and discovery. Used to be technical services. We have a different name now. Um, and this team primarily manages the metadata for our digital collections in Islandora. More recently, we took over oversight of our institutional repository that is not in Islandora. And we also have members that manage our authorities and our material transfer work. So Heijin, who's actually in the call listening, is also on our team. She's our authority control specialist. So the reason everybody's here is to talk about taxonomies in Islandora. So at the most basic level, Islandora is leveraging Drupal vocabularies to handle these taxonomies. In kind of a classic sense, these would be used as, for tagging or something in a website or on a blog or that kind of thing. We're just kind of ramping the Islandora models, ramping that up to 11, and really trying to take advantage of those. The taxonomies are used to classify content and to try to maintain consistency and structure in that classification. Um, Most of us are librarians. We love having things classified and easily organized. So this kind of jives with the kind of work that we want to do. A couple examples I have listed there. And a key piece here kind of goes with the next bullet. Like some of these control system behaviors and others are more about discovery and access to the material. So the Islandora model gives Islandora information about what it should be doing with this object, whereas like genres and resource type might be there to help a user understand it or find it. And these lists can be closed. You'll sometimes hear that called a fixed list or open, where we could add new terms. And there's, a lot of them, we're kind of thinking of them almost in this hybrid, like our lists, most of our lists are closed to everybody that's not on our team. Things have to kind of go through us to get added to that list to make sure we are maintaining a lot of control there. that isn't how you have to run them. You could allow any user to add new terms to a taxonomy. In other cases, a very closed list might be some of the ones that the system uses, where I could add terms to it all day, but it's not going to make the Islandora work differently because it would require code changes and other things to function. So it's just one thing to kind of keep in mind when you're thinking about these taxonomies. And I'll say now, Megan's going to kind of talk about some of these again, some of these kinds of topics again in her section. We're thinking about how we need to think about what we need to think about when we're setting up taxonomies. So you may hear some of these things repeated kind of in a different context. The really key part of this, I think, to understand, I mentioned it already, but just to repeat it, the taxonomy terms are, it's using Drupal vocabularies. Those terms are stored in those Drupal vocabularies. The metadata field is what puts them into action. So that field's type is determined how, if terms are used, if a taxonomy is used at all, and if it is, how it kind of functions. So this is that field type would determine if it's going to use a taxonomy term or if it's free text, or and really how that term gets used or is accessed. And another piece to kind of keep in mind here is when that we do use taxonomy terms, it's storing the URI for that object within our system. So we've identified a taxonomy term. Whenever we're adding that to an object's metadata, it's keeping track of that object site, that taxonomy term's identifier, not that string of text. And so there's some benefits there. We can do things like create controlled lists and autocomplete. So if someone's using a metadata form, they can start to type in a term, and appropriate terms will appear, or we can have them select from a list. We'll look at a couple examples of that and how they're set up. We can also store within a taxonomy term, it kind of has its own metadata. So a term, we might be able to store a description of what that term means. We might be able to store a link to an external reference, so that term in another vocabulary. We can potentially store related terms. So it does give us those opportunities. And because of that kind of authority linking and connecting them to external vocabularies, it does give us some opportunities to potentially use those same terms, reuse those outside of Islandora. Here's the examples I referenced. So this is a very simple one. This is field model. And you can see this is set up. That top row is kind of showing how the field is set up. The second row is showing how that field is rendered in the form. And then the third, kind of the bigger picture down at the bottom, is showing how that shows up in the form. So field model is connected to the Islandora models taxonomy. That's set up as a select list, so we can select one item from that. And then this is just kind of showing an example how you would select that. So a user could only select from this list. The next example gets a little bit more complicated. We're looking at field genre. The big difference here is we've connected two different taxonomies to this, and we're also using autocomplete. So the example at the bottom is showing both our genre taxonomy and our genre Japanese prints taxonomy. We didn't have to make these two separate. We could have put them all into genre. We chose to make a new taxonomy called Japanese prints because it was completely local. We don't have URIs for it. And we worked with our one of our East Asian librarians who does a lot of we do a lot of digitization of woodblock prints. And so there's a lot of terms that are used in that community that aren't in Art and Architecture's thesaurus. Is what we primarily use for our taxonomy terms for genre. And so the example here at the bottom is actually, we're auto completing. We started to type in the word mono, which appears in many of these Japanese print taxonomy terms, but it's also showing up in monotypes down at the bottom, which is a art and architecture thesaurus. So it's kind of it's showing that it's pulling from both of those vocabularies. The last example here is even a bit more complex. This is a different type. So these previous two were entity references. That's kind of the classic single term taxonomy. The type relation is something special, and this is how we connect the relationship that we often see with like names in our catalogs. So we have an author or a photographer. We want to identify that with a mark relator. Um, and so this is set up a little bit differently. You can see here we've got 4 vocabularies connected. We have conference, corporate body, family, and person. And we're using this typed relation widget to make it appear. And so in this case, it's not showing both, but the top half, this is kind of built into that typed relation widget. That top half is a pull down where I can select from a large list of mark relators. And then the bottom half is showing the autocomplete function. And here we can see a family name right at the top, Darlington Family. That came from the family taxonomy. Darlington Memorial Library would be a corporate name. And then the rest of them here, I think, are all persons. So just kind of a couple examples of what they might look like in your system when you have these set up and are using them. Um, there are other types beyond this type relation widget and the pull down. There's ones you can select multiple items. There's ones with checkboxes, but these are the ones that we kind of have implemented. This is live on one of our systems. So in practice, there's some advantages here for metadata creators. It allows people to select from a list. It potentially, depending on how you set up those lists, it might allow people to add new terms as necessary to meet their needs. So some of that can streamline and improve consistency. And the authority links allow us to potentially put multiple different kinds of vocabularies into the same taxonomy. So if we know we have a term from one and another, we can capture both of those and still kind of retain those connections to where they came from if we need that information later. From the user side, these are great for driving things like facets and filters. It allows us to get away from, in R7, we had Pittsburgh with a period after it. We had Pittsburgh, PA, we had Pennsylvania dash dash Pittsburgh. And so there was no way to just get all of the stuff that was about Pittsburgh from the results list. Now in our collections, that's probably almost everything anyway, but just as an example, this will help streamline that. We're gone are the days of like that and that with a period at the end. So as long as we kind of keep them and maintain them. We can do things like keeping these relationships with the terms, like we saw with the name. That's the only one where we're using this typed relation, but we can keep the role on this object attached to that name. So it's obvious to the user when we display the metadata that this is the composer, this is the arranger, this is the flutist or whatever on this object. And then finally, like this, it just to ensure the consistency, like we make sure that like when a user clicks on photographs, they're getting all of the materials that are tagged with photographs, and there aren't some in there that are also marked photo because of some kind of error. So that could still happen, but then it's a matter of cleaning up our taxonomy rather than having to clean up hundreds, dozens, thousands of objects. So that's a very high level, some of the advantages. I just wanted to put a few disadvantages here that I've either read about or heard about. I've seen things about slow Drupal UI with large vocabularies. We have pretty large vocabularies. I haven't seen too much of that behavior. The place I've seen it is in some of those autocompletes, depending on what you're typing in. I've sometimes seen that kind of spin for a little bit as it's trying to navigate this large, but it wasn't completely unwieldy in my experience. You can make the taxonomies very complex. All of ours are pretty flat right now, meaning that there's no hierarchy kind of built in, but we're interested in that potentially, which we'll talk about later. And that could add complexity to managing the taxonomies potentially. The fields, once they're created and attached, they become kind of fixed. So if you do have a change of heart or a change of mind, you want to change how a field works, you may need to rebuild that field and migrate the content over. You can't just make something into a taxonomy down the line or something, very easily. And then yeah, that really is just a lot about of that pre-thought, and doing some of the making sure you have everything lined up ahead of time. And then because we're often using external vocabularies, we want to we're going to need to keep those in alignment with those vocabularies most of the time. um, some of this kind of data, we're not planning on using the forms a lot, to be honest. Most of our work's probably going to happen in spreadsheets, and so we're going to need to build tools to be able to like check against the taxonomies while prior to doing the ingest. So I think some of this stuff will become a little bit more clear as sort of Megan and Tyrika walk through their part. So I'm gonna just kind of pass the baton instead of taking any more time and let Megan talk about some of the foundational stuff and what we did to kind of get ready to go into this realm.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Before we dive into the taxonomy implementation that Tyrika will be talking about, we just wanted to briefly touch on those foundations that made that work possible. First, I just want to note that at Pitt, we had already invested in structured metadata practices. We weren't starting from scratch. Necessarily, we had existing authority control processes, experience with controlled vocabularies, and a strong metadata infrastructure. And that gave us a head start when it came to designing and implementing taxonomies in a more formal, scalable way. Next slide, please, Mike. So Mike mentioned a bit of this about us earlier, but a big part of that foundation I mentioned is the Metadata and Discovery Unit, or MAD, which was formed in 2018. And working on digital collections, we have 3 metadata librarians and an authority control specialist. We're also part of that broader digital collections team at Pitt Mike discussed earlier. MAD centralized the expertise needed to manage metadata across collections, coordinate field cleanup efforts, and apply consistent standards. Our unit made it possible to take on large-scale remediation and taxonomy development with a sustainable and strategic approach. Next slide, please, Mike. So why go through the trouble of building taxonomies in I2, especially when they require so much upfront and long-term maintenance? We believe the payoff was worth it. And as I mentioned before, our previous work controlling metadata fields gave us a strong foundation to build on. So yes, the taxonomies require upfront labor and ongoing care, but the long-term benefits are compelling because they can lead to improved discovery and navigation, consistent metadata creation across contributors, enhanced system interoperability, and a better user experience overall. Next slide, please. So here's a bit of background on our work leading up to where we are today with our taxonomies. So before we could implement any taxonomies, we had to assess the quality of our legacy metadata. And we actually started this stage well before we began formally planning for the I2 migration. Initially, these were legacy data cleanup projects aimed at improving discovery in our existing system. And once we knew we were migrating and had chosen our vendor, the focus of these projects shifted so that cleanups became more required steps for migration readiness and not just enhancement projects. We initially did a lot of this work collection by collection through focusing on general cleanups, but later we started tackling larger scale projects across collection problems such as messy genres or geographic terms by utilizing more automated processes that helped us scale that work efficiently. As this assessment stage kind of laid that groundwork for structured vocabularies by ensuring we weren't importing like chaotic or contradictory data into I2. Next slide, please. So as we moved into the taxonomy creation, we encountered several decision points, especially around how fields should function. So first, you have to ask, what is this field for? If it's just descriptive, maybe a flat list is enough, but if it drives discovery, user experience, or background logic, it's most likely going to need a taxonomy. You also have to decide whether each field should be a taxonomy, a free text input, or something else entirely. One important thing to note, which Mike mentioned earlier, in Drupal, the field types are immutable, meaning you can't switch the fields from like text to taxonomy later easily. If you do make the wrong decision early on, changing it requires creating a new field and migrating data into that field. So because these choices have long-term consequences, it's best to try to get these right from the start. Finally, if you have to think about governance. Will this be a closed vocabulary? Can users add terms during ingest? If so, who's reviewing and approving those terms? Next slide, please, Mike. And beyond field setup, decisions also need to be made around authority alignment and term structure. So do you want to link to FAST, VOF, Getty, or other standards? Should you store only human readable labels or machine readable URIs as well? Think about the term structure. Some vocabularies are flat, others are hierarchical or require typed relationships, like distinguishing an author from a translator. Are you going to store synonyms or variant terms? Lastly, think about long-term maintenance. Who is updating these vocabularies over time? How do changes cascade through records? Do deprecated terms get flagged or redirected? These decisions shape not just the vocabularies themselves, but the metadata governance as a whole. Next slide, please. Thanks, Mike. Okay, so here you can see some examples of our taxonomy fields that required significant cleanup before they could be used in I2. Some of the fields, the ones with the asterisks next to them, like the contributing institution and subject title, we actually created these fields because they weren't originally part of the Born Digital out-of-the-box version. And just to note that you might experience something different depending on what vendor or version you're using. Okay, so the fields like contributor roles and geographic subjects in our metadata were messy, inconsistent, or just generally uncontrolled. So we had to normalize these values, define clear vocabularies, and decide which terms we should map to local versus national or international authorities. These vocabularies weren't just imported, they were intentionally built based on our metadata and use cases. Next slide, please. So fortunately, there were some vocabularies we could adopt more directly, like listed here, the ISO 639-2 for language, mark country codes, and using rightstatement.org. These still required some decision making, like how do we handle mismatches between legacy values and these standards? Do we use the full schema or a subset? But overall, pre-existing vocabularies gave us a stronger foundation, and aligning them made our metadata more interoperable and standards compliant. And now I'll pass it over to Tyrika to talk about actually implementing these taxonomies.
All right, thanks. So yeah, I will talk about what we did once we actually got into the active migration preparatory phase and during early migration. Next slide. So we started off by completing an inventory and assessment of our existing vocabularies. And this entailed exporting all of our terms in the Solr fields that we were going to be migrating to I2 and that needed to be reviewed. And we included the IDs of the objects with these terms. So to be easy for us to look up and view the objects to which these terms are being applied. And then we ran that exported data through a Python script, which created a table with one row for each unique term, and it had the number of occurrences throughout the data. And this was by field. I can talk a little bit more about why we did it by field a little bit later. It'll become a little bit more apparent. And then we assessed this output to determine the extent and the kind of remediations required for creating these taxonomies. Next slide. So in this slide, you can see on the left what we exported more or less from Solr. Something to note is that our data was previously stored, our descriptive metadata was stored in mods XML, but it was indexed in Solr, which didn't necessarily represent the hierarchical or nested data as cleanly. And so we had so many fields that where maybe it seemed like a lot, but it was just because of the way that Solar had to flatten mods data with the nesting, with attribute values to distinguish these different Solar fields. So what we're seeing here is specifically mod subject topic. This was one of the largest sets of vocabularies that we needed to review, but certainly not the only one. So you see there's a persistent identifier, and we were able to use that identifier to generate URL links. So it'd be very easy to just click on the object link and open and see it. Then this helped us to understand how the term was being applied, determine if it was accurate, and even sometimes distinguish between similar or exact names to make sure we knew which person, that we weren't looking at a junior versus a senior in a family, for example. The data in Solar is natively comma separated, but we chose to do pipe separation in our projects because it made it a lot easier to determine these distinct values from values that might have had commas in them. And then on the right side, you can see basically the beginnings of a remediation project spreadsheet opened in OpenRefine. Again, you're seeing the mod subject topic. And then we have, and that Solar field is really important because sometimes we had lots of different fields all in one. So for example, the names had 82 different Solar fields, but we didn't want to look at each 82 in each of those 82 in a separate OpenRefine project. So we concatenated them all into a single project, and we were able to separate each of them out by their field in this column. And then we have what originally was in that field. So in this case, we're not seeing like super complex values where we had to break them out into separate values, as you might see over here on the left, where we had like maybe 15 different values or something in that field for an object. But you see there's a count. And this helped us kind of understand like the prevalence and sometimes the significance of a term and whether it's worth cleaning and migrating. And then in the valid heading, this is where we did the work. We didn't touch the original heading at all so that we can understand where we started, and if we messed up, go back to it, but also just to keep track of what we have done to remediate the field. And so you can see there's a lot of stuff going on, some of it which Mike mentioned with these trailing periods, or Pittsburgh, comma, PA versus just a Pittsburgh, or PA versus Pennsylvania. And then there's so many things that this data represented, years and years and years of different practices of being migrated from different systems. And so there was a lot of standardization that we needed to do. And then we have the type column, and this is where we were categorizing these values. So they all might have been in subject topic, but they're clearly not all topics. These dates you see at the bottom were likely birth and death dates for a person who was a subdivision of a pre-coordinated or post-coordinated subject heading. And then in authority, this is where we determined at various points, would this be a part of the NACO authority? Would it be aligned to that authority, or would it be aligned to the LCSH, Library of Congress subject headings? And so this is where we kind of defined and kept track of the authority, which was really important for the taxonomy ingest. And then action is where we determined what we wanted to do with the term, and you'll see an example of different actions we could take. And then notes, which were kind of helpful throughout the process of remediation, but also once we got to the migrating phase, and this allowed us to make sure that we treated terms properly once we got to actual objects being moved over to I2. Next slide. So after all of the exports, we ended up having about 173 Solar fields to review, and these amounted to 12 taxonomies or vocabularies. And even though we had 12 vocabularies we were working with, they were broken down into 7 distinct projects. So for example, we didn't do all the names separately. We might have done names and corporate names together, and then titles separately or something like that. And then with the subjects, because the subjects were all over the place, and regardless of what mods solar field they were assigned to, they were very, very mixed. So we did the subjects all more or less at the same time, but there were just different phases between those different um, fields. And then next slide. So I've already mentioned with the previous slides that some of the goals after reviewing, assessing the our inventory of terms, we determined that we needed to do some categorization, which is assigning terms to the correct vocabulary. I'll be showing some examples of what this looks like in OpenRefine in the next set of slides, but we use facets and filters along with regular expressions to help us to bulk categorize these terms instead of doing them one by one, because we were working with approaching 100,000 distinct terms. And then we need to do standardization, which I talked about. We use OpenRefine's transform features, and you can use these languages like Grill, and Python, which is a Java implementation of Python, find and replace, enhanced by regular expressions, and manual editing. Um, and we did consolidation, removing those duplicate terms. We use OpenRefine's cluster and edit feature, as well as Python scripts to do this merging, and reconciliation, the alignment of these terms with authority sources where applicable. For that, we use OpenRefine's reconcile feature and the different authority sources, API services that we connected to. And we used OpenRefine a lot for these projects because it has the benefit of being able to visualize the data, but it also goes beyond what you might be able to do easily in something like Excel or even Google Sheets, because it builds in all of these robust features specifically for cleaning metadata. And so you'll see some of that in the next slide. So here is basically a project. This was when we were first starting to look at mod subject topic fields. You can see that there's almost 18,000 terms, not instances in our data, but 18,000 terms that we reviewed. And right now I'm filtering. If you look on the far left, you can see a filter in the original heading column. And basically what I'm doing here is I'm trying to find all the, not all, but a good number of these personal names. So I have a comma, and then you can see some regular expression being used. That /D stands for a number, an integer. And I want to look for 4 in a row, followed by a dash. So that would give me the birth year for a person following their name separated by a comma. So this was really helpful because I was then able to say, okay, almost everything that follows this pattern is going to be associated with the personal name vocabulary. And then you can see a little bit towards the middle of this image, a drop-down menu, which shows various features for remediating. You can see there's some common transforms that are built into OpenRefine, like removing leading and trailing white spaces, lower casing all the values, title casing values, and things like that. And then above the common transform, there is somewhere where you can click on transforms, and it opens up a box where you can put in some kind of expression using something like Grell or like Jython to more specific particular transformations on the data bulk. So it will apply to anything that meets the expression and is being filtered on. So I can change all 1330 values, and it's not going to affect anything that's not currently being filtered on right now. So that's super helpful. Next slide. And here you can see the cluster and edit feature that I talked about using for the consolidation process. So you can see what Mike was talking about, the mini versions of how Pittsburgh, PA, for example, was stored in the data. And it comes up multiple times in multiple ways. You can see it twice in these clusters here. But something that we were able to do is say, okay, well, we already know that we want to use the NACO files for Pittsburgh, the geographic term. And so that would be Pittsburgh space uh, parentheses, PA period, close parentheses, and no trailing periods, no commas in between. So we pick the correct one, and then we're able to merge all of those terms and replace anything that had a funky version of Pittsburgh with the correct version. And then you see design and construction, construction and design. This was a subject heading, and then we pick the correct forward, which would be most likely design and construction, I think, capital D, and everything else lowercase. So there are different methods you can use, and we had kind of like a order in which we applied a method or keying function to get through these clusters. Next slide. And this is showing a result of the reconcile feature. So in that valid heading column, this is where we did the reconciliation. Right now, I'm just filtering on things that would have been assigned to the LCSH authority. And you do have the ability to, sometimes if it's not close enough to a term in that authority or in that vocabulary, it will give you some options about what it could be. You can pick which one is the correct one for your use case. Or you can create a new term. And in that case, it would be local and not assigned to LCSH. And then once we got all of the terms reconciled that we possibly could, we created a column. You can do this using the reconcile feature. You can add a column with the URI for that term. So we didn't start off with URI because we could create it by using the reconcile feature. So that's what you're seeing here. This was really helpful too, because then I could use something like a regular expression to make sure that anything that had the subjects in the URI was assigned to LCSH instead of a name authority or something like that. Next slide.
So I want to say we also had genealogy spelled wrong 2 different ways, and we're able to get that corrected to the proper spelling.
So we divvied up our mediation projects based on areas of expertise. So Carolyn, who is our digital collections coordinator, was tasked with wrangling all of the source collection or archival collection information, including the identifier, the title, and the repository, which we use to make citations as well. Heijin, our authority control specialist, worked on all the names, which included geographic, personal, corporate, conference, and title, as well as geographic and temporal subjects. Megan worked on the beast that is the subject topic, vocabulary. And then I worked on pretty much everything else that I didn't want to assign to someone else. But also I have a history with collections as data, and I did a lot of data remediation and wrangling for that project or set of projects with our metadata. So I was familiar with working on things like form and genre. And then I also worked on related titles, which basically was creating citations from the nested related title information and mods. And then I also worked on subject genre because it was related to genre. Next slide. So these projects pretty much took place over the course of 8 months between August 2004 and April 2025. And we started actively doing migrating around that time, April, kind of March to May is when we were getting our getting our bearings with the migrating. But the steps, I've already talked about some of these. We exported the data from Solar. We took inventories. We assessed the terms. Once we've done the assessment, we created documentation, which included background for the project, the goals of the project, the workflow, step by step, so that everyone could follow that workflow and be able to reference the documentation, as well as notes to keep track of things that came up throughout the project. Then I generated and distributed and managed these project spreadsheets, which we usually worked on in OpenRefine, and we completed our remediations. The final product were CSV files that contain mappings of our legacy terms to valid standardized terms that we wanted to import into I2S taxonomies. Next slide. Here's an example of a completed project spreadsheet. You see all those fields filled out. You see the difference between original heading and valid heading. We've assigned things to authorities or our local vocabulary. We assign types for the vocabularies and actions that the migration script would implement, whether it be replacing a term, keeping the term as is, removing a term or ignoring it. And I identify in a note why it was being removed, just for references. And then sometimes we need to split a term. So at the bottom, you see the original term was 110th Infantry. We wanted to keep some of the different levels of that hierarchy for collation purposes. So we have United States Army, and then we also have United States Army, Pennsylvania Infantry, 110th, 1861, 1865. So this is kind of a little bit of what that looked like to complete a remediation project. Next slide. So after we did all these mappings, we were then able to create taxonomies using Python scripts that easily converted from the mapping, took the fields that we needed, and formatted that CSV in the way that Workbench was expecting it for the ingest of the taxonomies. And then we went ahead and ingested those taxonomies. Next slide. So here's an example of a snippet of the script for converting from mapping to taxonomy. I won't go through the details of that right now. And then on the right, you see the CSV opened up in OpenRefine. So you have the term name, we have a particular formatting of the authority field link. So it has the authority code, in this case AAT for the genres, art and architecture thesaurus, followed by 2% signs, and then the URI for that term. And then there, in this case, we were able to grab from OpenRefine all of the descriptions for these terms in AAT. Next slide. So even though we had ingested these taxonomies, we were continuing to do some cleanup work, but Mike needed us to get started with migrating. So we were still doing some cleanup work while or the migrating had already started. So we needed to ensure that the taxonomies were up to date with the mappings. And so we had a Python script that compared the taxonomies, all the taxonomy CSVs with all the mapping CSVs to make sure that they were in alignment. If they were not in alignment, that meant that we might have needed to add a term to the taxonomy. We might need to fix a term in the taxonomy or in the mapping, or just ignore the term in the mapping because we were going to be removing it anyway in the data. Next slide. Here's a snippet of the script that we use to do the comparison between the taxonomy and the mapping. And then you can see on the right, those cases in which, some cases in which the terms in the mapping were not in an ingested taxonomy. As you can see, a lot of these were going to be removed anyway, so it's fine to keep them as is because they wouldn't be going into I2. But sometimes in that invalid name column, we're able to say, okay, we fixed it here in the mapping, so now it matches what the taxonomy says, or we updated the taxonomy or added it to the taxonomy. So we kind of did this periodically as we continued to work on the mappings. Next slide. So finally, we were actually doing the preparing the CSVs for migration. Uh, and this was an extract and transform Python script to go from Solar to I2. And this script did a lot of things, but as far as vocabularies or taxonomies are concerned, it checked the original data, the terms in original data, performed whatever action it was supposed to perform, and it reported terms that were transformed, terms that weren't found in a mapping, terms that had notes associated with them because we needed to maybe look out for something and make sure we addressed it properly before importing that batch. And then the next step was ingesting the batch into Workbench. But before we actually did the actual ingest, we did a check, running a Workbench create task with check. And this disallowing the new terms are being created so that it will report any terms that were not in a taxonomy. Next slide. So you can see this snippet of the migration script. This is the part where it's handling subject terms. And then on the right, you can see um, a an exception report where it has a lot of terms that were in the data but weren't in the mapping. So it didn't know what to do with it. So it reported it, and then we can figure out what to do with it next. Next slide. And this is just Workbench telling us uh, which terms and where weren't in a taxonomy. So that last check. And I think that's it.
All right, I'm gonna move through this super fast just so we have a couple minutes for people have questions. We're going to continue to do some work around standardization and normalization. Stuff got through. We're dealing with hundreds of thousands, millions of objects, hundreds of thousands of taxonomy terms, thousands and thousands. So, I mean, we just saw one yesterday when we're putting some stuff in for the presentation. We found the same name twice, once with dates and once without dates, because one of them got split somewhere. So we're going to try to do some projects in the future to do more standardization and normalization, maybe even creating new taxonomies. We also want to do make an authority control plan for this. Like, how often should we try to reconcile these? How are we going? We have a plan for getting the data out and running it through reconciliation and then, confirming or updating. But we do this monthly with our catalog, but is it enough to do this quarterly or annually? And like, how complex is it going to be? The other things we want to think about is like how synonyms and related terms might be usable. We're not currently indexing our taxonomy terms, so we're not quite sure how we feel about how that works with discovery. So we'd be interested in ways to, if we were to incorporate more related terms or synonyms for terms, how to ensure that the user experience of searching for those terms returns results that they're expecting. Um, we're also interested in potentially looking at hierarchical taxonomies, particularly in the area of geographic names. I know Rosie's done some cool stuff with that at the PEI sites to make accessibility and reduce the number of kind of duplicative terms you might need to return results. Pittsburgh wouldn't it would be nice if it would return in the Pennsylvania facet, for example. And then potentially some other user facing enhancements. Are there other browse options that we might want to incorporate using taxonomies for, and potentially just creating richer landing pages for those taxonomy terms? It's a little bit jarring the way it's set up out of the box with you click on a taxonomy term in a record and you're returned to a page. So that was it. We don't have a ton of time for questions, but we're happy to take any if folks have them. You can also reach out to any of us we're happy to talk to people
Great.
outside of the call.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording before we have any questions.